Alright, so we're back with a brand new video. So in the original ticket bot tutorial, the first episode, we covered a lot of stuff. We covered how to create tickets, how to save tickets to the database, and how to close tickets. And majority of those things were done through updating the permission overrides. In this tutorial, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can actually configure roles for your ticket bot. So essentially, you would probably want staff roles to be able to manage tickets. Let's say if you're the admin and you cannot be on your computer all the time to manage people's tickets, you want to give your staff roles the ability to actually manage tickets. So I'll show you how we can create a slash command that will configure the roles, and then it'll basically save it to the database configuration. And so whenever we create new tickets, it will basically add that role as a valid user to actually see the channels. So basically, users who have that role will be able to see the ticket channels. They'll be able to send messages, and they can also do things with the ticket. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and configure that. So inside my code, what we need to do is we need to first go to where we register our slash commands. So that's right over here in the index.ts file. And essentially what I want to do is I want to actually set up a roles command. I want to set up a sub command called roles. That'll be the base command, and then there'll be stuff like add and delete. So we can actually add and delete roles, okay? So let's do this. Let's create a new slash command builder instance. And then what I'll do is I'll call this, let's call this set name, and we'll call this roles. And we'll call this set description. Manage roles for ticket bot. And then what we want to do is we want to add a subcommand. And you could do subcommand group if you want to. I'll just do subcommand. And this subcommand will basically have the name of add, right? So the user will have to do /roles add in order to add roles to the setup, to the ticket configuration. So subcommand set name, add set description, adds a guild role to the ticket configuration. Now this ticket configuration can be a majority of different things. For our use case, we're really just doing this for staff roles, so that way when we create tickets, the staff will be able to see it. So that's our main purpose behind this. But if you actually want to do something different, you would have to ensure that you apply the necessary logic. But I'm just giving you an example of what you could do. Okay, so let's do this. So adds a guild role to the ticket configuration, and I think that should be more than enough, I think. And let's just make sure that the role is, or not the role, the command is being registered properly first before we continue. So I'm just waiting for the bot to restart. But as we're waiting for it to relog in, we're going to need to add an option, a role option, because we want the admin to be able to select which role they want to configure. And we also are going to make sure that the person actually what we'll do is we'll disable this command, but only admins will be able to use it. Or we can also set the permission of it as well. But let's go to our server. And if you look at our server, if I do /, I can see the roles add command, okay? And it says adds a guild role to the ticket configuration. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish configuring this subcommand. Well, we actually are not going to add the permission for the subcommand. We're actually going to do it for the base command, which is roles. So we'll do set default member permissions, and we'll set this to 0. So this will just disable it by default, but because we're admin, we'll still be able to use it. And then for the subcommand, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a role option. And we have to configure the option, so we'll set the name of this option to role, set description, the role to add to the config. I should call this ticket config. and then we will make it so that it is required. I can't type today for some reason. And then I think that should be it. Yeah, that should be it. So let's just restart our bot. Let's make sure that our command is working as it should be. Okay, so if I do slash roles add, you can see that the option shows up, and you can see that I can select specific roles. Okay, so this is basically what I'm talking about. Is I would want to select any role that I want to represent my staff. So you might have different staff roles, right? But you want all those staff roles to be able to manage tickets. So you would select the staff role, and then when you hit enter, what happens is it's going to check the database to see if the ticket configuration exists. If it doesn't, it'll just send an error message, right? So we'll need to make sure we have a ticket configuration already set up, which means that the user will have to use the initial setup command first. Okay, so if the ticket config does exist, right, we will add this role to the ticket configuration. So whenever we need to do anything, we have the necessary roles on the server being able to actually manage tickets. So for example, all of the roles that are going to be added on the ticket config role will be able to manage tickets. Okay, that's basically the whole idea behind this. All right, it might not make too much sense right now, but I promise you, it'll make a lot more sense once you see the whole product, once you see everything being implemented. So don't worry, just stick along. So we're done with the slash command. So now we just need to handle the slash command. So all we need to do is just go into interaction create. We can see that we are emitting our custom chat input command event. So we'll need to go into that handle chat input command function that is handling this custom event. And like I said, make sure you watch the first tutorial first. The link will be in the description. But this handle chat input command function is implemented inside this chat input command.ts file. So let's go inside here. And we are using a switch case. So we have a case for setup. Let's go ahead and create a case for... let's do this case. We will do roles. Okay, so now this is actually a little bit tricky because we are using a sub command this time. So we do need to make sure we check to see which sub command we are using, right? Because right now we only have one sub command, and that one sub command is add, but we will also have a remove sub command because we also want to allow admins to be able to remove roles. Maybe you might not want that staff to be able to manage tickets anymore, so you'll remove that role. Okay, so we'll need to handle that case. So first, let's just go ahead and do this, right? So we already have the condition on the interaction command name, right? So if you actually, so I'll show you this real quick. Let me show you the command name so you can see what is going to happen when we send the roles add command. You'll see that roles will be the name of the command, but we still need to check to see what the sub command is. So our bot has logged in. So let me just go ahead and just send this message, and you'll see that in the logs it says roles, but we have no information about the add subcommand from that command name, and that's okay. What we need to do is we need to go ahead and get the subcommand from options, and I'll show you how to do that. So let me just exit out of the terminal or the application, and what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reference interaction, right? And there's no subcommand property, right? We need to reference options, and what we want to do is we want to just call it get subcommand, okay? And what we want to do is we just want to pass in the name of the subcommand, which is add. Okay. What's going on over here? Well, actually, wait, sorry. It's actually just get subcommand. And yeah, that's it. So you can actually pass in a boolean, but this will basically just get the subcommand that was executed. Okay. So let's go ahead and rerun the bot. Okay, and now if I were to go ahead and issue this command again, you can see that it logs roles and then it logs add. And again, you might have multiple subcommands. In our case, we will. So we would need to have another if-else case, or you could also have a switch case, but I'll just use an if-else case for this situation. Actually, here's what I'll do. I'll actually create an additional function. So I'll do this. Roles command handler.ts. And I'll create my function inside here because I don't want to create everything in just one big giant switch case. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and create a function called handle rules command. Export async function. And then what we'll do is if the case is roles, I'll just literally just do this. I will call handle rules command, and we're going to pass in the client and the interaction object, which we have as arguments up top over here. Okay, so we'll pass that into this handle rules command function. Okay, so let me just move this to the side over here. And then again over here, we'll need to accept those as arguments. So let's import the client class because that's the data type of the client object. And then for the interaction, we know it's going to be a we know it's going to be a chat input interaction. So the correct type is going to be chat input command interaction, and it's generic, so we'll specify cache type like that. So let's import these two types from Discord.js library. And there we go. So now we can call this function, so we don't have to put everything in one single case. Okay, and inside this function we can have our own. We can have another switch case for each subcommand, or not each subcommand. We can have a switch case to handle the subcommand, or we can just use an if-else case. I'll use a switch case. Okay, but actually, what I'll do is I'll actually get the subcommand. So we'll do subcommand equals interaction dot options dot get subcommand, and then we'll do a switch case, and then subcommand is going to be a string. Okay, it's going to be a string, and then we'll set up cases, right? So let's do the case for add, and let's just do a break over here. Okay, and instead of I'll just do return. Okay, that'll be a lot better. And yeah, so basically if we are handling the roles command, it's going to call handle roles command function. And when it calls this function, we're going to figure out what the subcommand is, and then we'll handle the case for the subcommand. So I'll write a simple console log over here. And I'll just write a console log subcommand, just so that you are seeing what's happening. So that way you're not seeing that I'm just writing a bunch of code, and you're not really understanding how everything is being executed. So I want you guys to understand how everything is working. So let's just wait for our bot to restart. But you'll see that when we use the roles command in just a second, it's going to call this function, and then it's going to log these two in our console. All right, so our bot is relogged in. So let's go ahead and just use the roles add command. Let's select the staff role, and if you look at the logs, it's going to say handle roles command and then subcommand add. So that's good. So we know that it's calling the correct function. Okay, it's good to test these things just to make sure that it's actually hitting the necessary logic. Okay, we issued the roles base command, and it targeted this case, and then inside this block we're calling handle roles command, and then we can see that these two things are being logged. So now we're handling the switch case for the subcommand, and we need to handle the case when it is the subcommand is add. So yeah, I think the best thing to do is obviously create another function to invoke. So I'll just create that function inside this file because I don't want to create so many different files for now. So I'll just leave it like this for now. So export async function handle rules add subcommand, something like this, right? So now inside this function, what we're going to do is we're going to just basically pass down the client as well as the interaction objects. So I'll go ahead and copy these two arguments for the handle roles command function, and I'll just provide the same signature as well. And then we'll just pass in the client and interaction just like that. And instead of using a break, we'll just do return, so we can save some lines of code just like this. Okay, so in this handle roles add subcommand, basically all we need to do is just take the role that the user had entered, and we need to just basically add it to the ticket configuration. But how do we do that though? So with the ticket configuration, it's going to have a property called roles, and it's going to work like an array, but underneath the hood, it's not really an array. Because with MySQL databases, it doesn't really necessarily support an array data type. I mean, I think it does, but the proper way to handle arrays or lists of values is by using a one-to-many relationship. In our situation, we have one ticket configuration, and the ticket configuration can have many different roles, like staff roles, that can be applied to that ticket configuration, right? Because for example, when you set up your ticket bot, you might want to have, like, 3 different staff roles. So each one of those roles are going to have a relationship with the individual ticket config. So in our case, it's a one-to-many relationship between the ticket config and the roles. Okay, so we will have to create a new type ORM entity representing the ticket config roles, but don't worry about that. It's really simple. So the first thing that we'll do inside handle roles add subcommand is this. We will go ahead and check to see if the user has a ticket configuration. But I think it makes more sense to do that inside handle roles command. The reason why is because we should automatically assume that if they're using the add subcommand, that they already have a configuration. So if we don't have that config, we should just return some kind of message saying that, yeah, you don't have a configuration set up. So we need to query the database. So we'll need to query the database for a ticket config. So we'll go ahead and get the repository for ticket config. So up top over here, I'll just do const ticket config repository equals app data source. So we're going to import app data source from type ORM folder, which is this export over here. We're basically importing this into where we need it. And we're going to use this data source to get the correct repository that we want to work with. And that's how we're going to interact with the database. So I'm going to call get repository, and I'm going to pass in the correct entity, which is ticket config, like that. And now what I can do is I can reference the repository. So let me go ahead and create a variable called ticket config. And we're going to use async await, because ticket config repositories methods, well, for find one by, it's going to return a promise. So we need to await it. So we're going to reference ticket config repository. We will call find one by, and we want to basically search by the guild ID, because if you look at the type ORM entity, the guild ID is always going to be unique, and we know that if there is a record in the database that exists for a guild with that specific ID, we know that that means that they have a ticket config already. So we're going to search by guild ID. So we're going to pass in for guild ID, we'll have to pass in the guild ID. So I'll get the guild ID like this. I'll basically just destructure the guild ID from the interaction object like that. But I'll also do this. I'll do, instead of actually destructuring it, what I'll do instead is I'll actually assign it to interaction.guildid or an empty string. So that way we don't have to worry about this being null. Okay? So it's going to search the database for a ticket config based on the guild ID. If there's no ticket config, we will return a message, and I guess we'll just reply to the interaction, and we'll just say content, you do not have a ticket config set up, use the /setup command. And we can make this message ephemeral. Okay, so we'll return this interaction.reply method call. So basically we're just replying to the user saying that, hey, you don't have a ticket config, run the setup command to get yourself a ticket config set up, and then you can use this command. So if the ticket config does exist, then we could just call handle rules add subcommand. I think we might need to pass in the ticket config into this function. So I'll just do that. I'll just do config. Well, actually, it's ticket config, so we'll just pass that in like that. and then we'll have to take that parameter in, and I'll just call it ticket config just to be consistent. And the type of this is going to be a ticket config, of course, ticket config entity. Okay, so now that we know that the user does have or the admin does have a ticket config set up in the database, now we can actually add the role to the user. So here inside this function, what we'll do is we'll get the role that the user had selected. So we'll get that by referencing interaction dot options, and we'll call get role, and we need to pass in the name that we had provided for that role option. So if we go into our index.ts, if you look at slash command, we can see that the name for this option was called role, and that's what we'll pass in here. Hold on. Yep. And then it is required, so we could pass true for this. Okay. Because we know that that option is required. Okay. So this will always be defined. Okay. So we're gonna get the role, and then what we want to do is we want to basically take that role and add it to the ticket config. Okay, because remember, we're creating a relationship between the ticket configuration and the role itself. Okay, now ideally what we should also do is we should also search to see if the ticket config does already have that specific role. Okay, so in order for us to proceed from this, we actually need to create the role, the ticket config role entity first, and I'll show you how we can set up the relationship between those two entities, between ticket config and ticket config role. So let's step away from this function. Let's go into entities. Let's create a new file. We'll call this ticket config role. You don't have to call it this. You can call it something like staff roles if you want to, or ticket staff roles. You can call it whatever you want, but I'll just call it ticket config role for now. Okay, and we're basically just going to create a class called ticket config role, and what I'll do is I'll just mark this as a type R entity, and the name will be ticket config roles, just like that. So let's go ahead and just use the primary generated column decorator to set up the primary key. We'll definitely need the role ID, so we'll create a property called role ID. This will be of type string. And I mean to do that other data type. And for this, we'll just use the column decorator for now. And yeah, I think that's really all we'll need for now. We just really need the role ID. We don't really care about anything else. So now we need to set up the relationship between ticket config and ticket config role. So ticket config has a one-to-many relationship to the ticket config role, because the ticket config can have many ticket config roles, right? Because you don't necessarily want to have just one staff role. Sometimes you might have multiple. So the ticket config is going to have multiple different roles that it can use to apply to certain scenarios. In our case, we want those roles to represent staff roles. So those staff roles will be able to manage the tickets. Okay? So what we have to do is we have to set up the relationship. So to do that, we do it this way. So we're going to use the one-to-many decorator, and we're going to pass in an arrow function, and this is going to basically map to the entity that we have the relationship with, which is ticket config role. And then we have to pass in a second parameter, which is also going to be a callback function. And basically this callback function is just going to take in the config role as an object, and we're going to need to create a property on that entity in just a second. So that property name will be called ticket config, which we have not created yet, but we will. And then the name of this property will be called roles, and then the data type will be ticket config role array, like that. And then what we'll do on the ticket config role entity is we'll do the inverse, right? So we have one-to-many for ticket config, and now we want to do many-to-one. Okay, so it's kind of like the opposite or the inverse if you think about it, right? Because many roles are going to belong to one ticket config. One ticket config is going to have many roles. Okay, or I should say a role belongs to a ticket config. At first, it might be a little bit confusing, but don't worry so much about that. You'll understand the intuition over time. Okay, so we're going to pass in an arrow function. It's going to map to, and we're going to pass in ticket config like this. It's going to auto import from the same directory, and then we're going to pass in a callback function again, and this is just going to be the actual config instance. So similar to how we did it with one-to-many, we had role, but in this case it's going to be config, which is just going to be the ticket config. And then we just are going to reference config dot roles, which is the property that we just created. Okay, and then we're going to name the property here the same exact name that we named it right over here, ticket config. And then the type is going to be ticket config like this. So you can see that these two things are basically the inverse of each other. Okay, you can think of it like opposite in a way. That's how you set up a one-to-many and many-to-one relationship between two entities. Okay, so now what we can do is we can actually just add the role to the ticket config, right? We can insert it. Well, we can basically create a ticket config role, and then we can attach that to the ticket config. So we know that ticket config and the specific ticket config role have a relationship. So when we query the ticket config, we'll be able to get all of the roles that belong to that ticket config. And you'll see how that will work when we actually add the roles, okay? Let's do one more thing. Let's go into index and let's go ahead and import ticket config role like this. So that way we register that as a type ORM entity. Okay, so it'll actually create the table in the database because we are synchronizing everything, which is good. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to basically search the ticket config role table, and we need to check to see if that role ID is already found. Okay, and we also need to make sure that it also belongs to that ticket config. Okay. Another thing that you could also do is you could also just check the ticket config, and you can check the roles property, and you can check to see if it has, or you can check to see, you can use the find method and see if it has a specific role. I think actually that'll probably be the better thing to do instead of having to query the database, in my opinion. So that's what we'll do. Okay. So for now, what I'll do is this. When we get the role, we'll create a new entity. We'll create a new instance of the entity. So what I'll do is we'll do this. So we'll assume that the role does not exist, and then we'll create it. So const new role equals, and we're going to need to get the ticket config role repository. Okay. So up top here, we'll do const ticket config role repository equals app data source get repository ticket config role. Import that. Whoops. Like that. Okay. So now we can reference this repository, and then we can go ahead and call create and pass in the role ID. Okay. And in our case, we're just going to pass in role.id. Okay. And what we also need to pass in is the entity that this relates to. In our case, it's ticket config. So how do we know? Well, for ticket config, all we do is just pass in ticket config right over here. That's the property name, and it corresponds to this ticket config over here. That's how we can basically insert this role and ensure that this role has the relationship with the correct ticket configuration. Okay, so now all we need to do is just save the role. So I'll go ahead and create a variable called saved role equals await ticket config role repository, and then we'll call save new role. Okay, I'll run a console log and I'll say save role to DB. And I think that should be it. We will reply to the interaction later on. But let's go ahead and test this all out and make sure that it in fact works. So let's go ahead and rerun our app. Might get an error actually. Yeah, I think we might be returning from. I think I need to await this, and then I need to break. I think that might be what the problem is, because it's basically complaining about the return type of handle check input. So it's likely coming from here. It's likely coming from here. Handle roles command. Yeah, it's likely this. So let me do this. Let me just fix this a little bit. And I think we should be good to go. There shouldn't be any more issues. Yeah, it was basically complaining about how I was returning the interaction, because TypeScript is really, really strict with its types. So, but fixing that should do the trick. Okay, so our bot has logged in. Let's go ahead and try to configure our roles now. So on our Discord server, I will go ahead and do /roles, add do staff, and let's see what happened. So it seems like no issues occurred in our console, which is great. Okay, now let me go ahead and log into my database. Let me just grab my database name. Okay, so I just logged into my database. Let's do show tables. Now let's do select from tickets or ticket configs. And you can see that we have our ticket config, the same one that we had before. Let's go ahead and select ticket config roles. And now watch this. We have the role ID. We have our record. That's our primary key. And then we have this foreign key, right? This is a foreign key. And that foreign key is basically useful because it allows us to know which record this belongs to for the parent table, the ticket configs table. Okay, when I type describe ticket config roles, you can see that ticket config ID key is MUL. Okay, so basically now we can basically insert multiple different roles inside this database for our configuration, right? So I can go ahead and add more roles if I want to. So I can do, let's say, blue. If I select the table, you can see now I have more roles, and each one of these roles belongs to the ticket config where its primary key is 1, right? Because this foreign key for this, you can think of this as a child table, right? This foreign key is basically the primary key for the ticket config. So if I wanted to write a SQL statement where I did something like select asterisk from, so select all columns from ticket config, and then I could do like maybe like some kind of inner join, or maybe something like this: select asterisk from ticket config roles where ticket config ID. If I know the ticket configurations ID, I can pass that in there like that, and then this is how I would get all the roles. Okay, but we don't have to do that because type ORM basically maps everything for us. So all we would need to do is just query the ticket config, and we can just reference the roles, and we'd be able to get all the roles. So whenever we need to create new ticket channels, we will be able to get the roles by just referencing that roles property that we defined as an array. And you'll see that in just a second. But first, what we want to do, instead of having to create the role every single time, what we should do is we should query the ticket config roles table, and we should check to see if that role ID exists already for that ticket config ID. We know that the role ID is only going to belong to a specific guild, so there's never going to be an issue where the role ID should ever really like belong in two different guilds. So we don't really need to worry about the guild ID. We just need to make sure that if the user has a role ID that belongs to a ticket config, we need to make sure that we check that. Otherwise, we're going to have duplicates, and that's not good. Okay, so what we're going to do is this. Before we create the role, we're going to go ahead and query the database. So let's do const role, let's do role config or ticket config role equals await ticket config role repository, find one by, and we want to essentially search by two conditions: search by the role ID as well as the ticket config ID. So I'm going to narrow this down to ticket config. I'm going to map this to an object, and you can actually do this to narrow down the search. So I'll do ID and then ticket config.id. Okay, you could actually just pass in ticket config like this, and that would also work too. Okay, so let me just pass in role.id like this. So this would basically search the database for a record where the role ID matches as well as the ticket config. And if that doesn't exist, then we can create it. If it does, then we cannot create that because it will be a duplicate. Okay, so if ticket config role exists, what we'll do is we will just await interaction reply content that role already is added. Okay. We should also do something where actually what I think what we'll have to do is, because we also want to allow the user to remove rules, so we will have to be able to delete records from that table later. So yeah, we'll just leave it like this. That role is already added, and then when we remove rules, when we search for it again, it should not appear. And you'll see we'll test everything, so don't worry. Okay, so we'll return. So if ticket config role exists, we will reply saying that the role already is added. Okay, if it doesn't exist, then we'll create it and then we will save it to the database. Okay, and then we'll reply to the user. We'll say role added successfully. Okay, and yeah, that should be pretty much it. So now let's go ahead and test this out. Right, so let's go back into our code, or not code, our console. And right now, if we look at our table, you can see that I have two roles that have already been configured, and they belong to the ticket configuration where the ID is 1, and that's our only ticket config for our guild. If I were to test this with a secondary guild, right, that I can create a second guild, and that second guild would have its own ticket config, right? And then I can create role configurations for that ticket config for that new guild, right? So each guild will have its own configurations. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So let's try to add a role for staff, and you're going to see that it says that role already is added, and because we did that check. Okay, now watch this. If I were to try to add a new role, let's try the green role added successfully. If I go ahead and query the database, you'll see that that role has successfully been added to our ticket configuration for our guild. If I try to add it again, it's going to tell us that role already is added. If I were to just delete everything from ticket config roles, I'll just delete everything from the table, and I'll go ahead and just add the staff role again. I can go ahead and add the blue role again. I don't know if I did that earlier, but I can just basically add the roles that I've already added already, right? And there will be no issue. You can see right over here that they are all added. Okay, and when I want to delete a role, I can do that. And if I want to add it again, I can do it as well. So we know that our delete is going to work later on. We'll implement that and worry about that later. So we know that adding works. So that's great. Okay, so we know that right now we're able to add roles to our configuration. So now how do we actually take this and apply it to our creation of tickets? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go over to our bun interaction.ts file inside the handlers folder. And we basically want to go to the logic where we are creating the ticket. And we want to search for where we are creating the channel. And essentially what we want to do is right over here in this permission overrides, we basically want to add additional permission overrides for those roles that are part of that ticket config repository. So if we have not searched for the ticket config, then we'll have to. But it seems like we already did right over here, which is good. Okay. And if they don't have a ticket config, then they can't really do anything I think yeah, it won't create one if I remember correctly. So they need to have a ticket config in order for them to create the ticket. And we have that right over here. Perfect. Perfect. Now, let's go ahead and do this. Before we even update the permissions, let's just go ahead and log ticket config. And let's just make sure that it's actually going to give us the relations, which is the roles, right? Let's just make sure that it actually will give us the roles. So what I'll do is I'll try to create a ticket right now. Let's go over to the support channel. Let's create a ticket. And if I go into the console, you can see that when it logs ticket config, it doesn't even log roles. And the reason why is because we have a one-to-many and many-to-one relationship. By default, type ORM will not show properties that are one-to-many or many-to-one relationships. So you'll need to actually explicitly specify it. You'll need to actually specify what relations you want. So to do this, to specify the relations, we're going to modify this line of code where we search for the ticket config. So instead of using find one by, what we'll do instead is we'll do this. We will do find one. We'll pass in options, an options object. We're going to use this where property, and it's going to map to an object. And we're just going to specify the condition of what we want to search. So guild ID. So it'll be the same thing that we had earlier. Guild ID or empty string. But then after the where property, we'll specify relations. And then this is going to be an array. And we just have to specify what relations we want. In our case, it's just going to be the roles property. It's the same property name that we had defined for the ticket config entity. As you can see right over here. Okay. So that's how we do that. And then let's go ahead and create a ticket again. And we'll look at the logs. And you'll see that the logs will actually log the roles this time. So let's go into our Discord. Let's close this ticket first. Let's create another ticket. And you can see now it actually logs the roles. And you can see that it's an array. So the same thing that I said before, it's going to be an array, and it has all of the ticket config role instances. So we can very easily just reference the roles property, and we can just literally just get all of the roles and apply the permissions the way that we want to. So now that we have the roles, now that we can actually reference them, okay, we need to just go down to permission overrides. And this is going to be a little bit tricky because what we need to actually do is we need to apply permission overrides for each role. So what we could do is we can just do this. So right down over here, I'm going to do a little bit of JavaScript magic. So I'm going to go after this save ticket variable, and I'll do const role permissions. And this is going to be equal to ticket config dot roles. And essentially what we're going to do is we know that this is an array, and we basically just want to use the map function to transform this array. That'll return a new array, but that will be in the format that we need for permission overrides. So I'll show you. So we're going to call .map, and this is just going to take in, well, so the callback function is going to basically have the config role entity, and essentially what we want to do is we just want to pass in, or we want to return an object, so allow, and then the array of permissions. So in our case, it's just view channel and send messages, and then we just basically want to pass in the ID. So we're going to reference role. Remember, this is the role config entity from the database, and we're just going to reference role ID because that's the role ID that we want to set the permissions for. Okay. And then what happens here is we return a new array, and that array is just going to look like these objects over here. Those objects are going to look exactly like this. Okay. Because like I said, we could have an indefinite amount of staff roles, so that's why you want to call .map on the roles array. So if I console log this now, to show you what happens. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this ticket, and let's create another ticket. and pay attention to the logs. See how we now have this array, and we basically transformed all the objects. We returned a new array that had the correct format for the permission overrides, and it has the corresponding roles and the permissions. So what we can do now is we could basically take this role permissions array, and what I can do is I can just basically spread this array like this. Not sure why it's giving me this issue. Okay, I think I know what the problem is. I'm going to cast this as overwrite. Let me actually see this real quick. So yeah, it's complaining about the types because allow is actually an overwrite resolvable. Or let me do this actually. Yeah, let me do that instead. So overwrite resolvable is going to be the data type that we're going to import up top over here. Because like I said, we're using TypeScript, so we have to be very careful with everything with types. So we're just going to set this data type as an overwrite resolvable. And yeah, like basically we can get type inference, so we can explicitly set allow and ID. Okay, and you can see that it gives us IntelliSense over there, which is good. Okay, so TypeScript now knows that this variable is in fact the correct data type, so we can then use the spreader operator for this array. And it's just basically going to unpack all those objects and then just add it to this array over here. So that's just some JavaScript magic. Okay, so now let's go ahead and close our ticket and let's reopen the ticket. And you're going to see, you're going to pay close attention to the permissions. See how right now I only have 2 permissions, right? Pay close attention now. When I go ahead and I create a new ticket and this channel is created, and you're going to see that all of the roles that I have added are now added to this channel, and they have the necessary permissions that we had configured. And you can pretend like these are staff roles, and now your staff can actually see the channel and they can send messages in that server. A good example is this account over here has the staff role, and we gave permissions for this channel for that staff role, and it can basically do whatever it wants to do. So we're not done yet, because obviously if we close a ticket, those users with that staff role will still be able to see those channels, right? Because I don't really think it actually does anything. Or does it actually? Actually, you know what? We actually don't even need to worry about removing their permissions, because, and the reason why is because, like I said in the last video, when you call permission overrides, right, it basically overwrites every single permission. So because we actually don't have those permissions set for those roles, they're just removed, right? Now, again, it depends on how you want to handle things. Like, do you still want your staff to be able to see that channel? If yes, then you should include them inside here, inside this array. So we'll have to do the same exact thing. So I actually am going to backtrack on what I said about not needing to add them to the channel, because if you don't, they're not going to see the channel anymore, and they might need to see the channel because they're the ones managing the tickets. So let me go ahead and just fix that. So we do need to make sure that we have the ticket config. So I think what I'll do is this. I think what would be better is if we actually took this whole logic and we moved it out one step out here, because, you know, if they're trying to interact with creating a ticket and there's no ticket config, then it shouldn't even work in the first place. So let's just move this out one step, so we know that inside this entire switch case, that in every single case that we handle, there's always going to be a ticket config no matter what. Okay, so that shouldn't affect the rest of the logic. We should still be able to search for the database, search for the correct ticket config. If it doesn't exist, we return and we do nothing. Okay, so now inside close ticket, we can reference ticket config. Okay, and we can basically get all the necessary roles. So I'm just going to copy and paste the same thing that I did again. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to copy this right over here. I'm going to go down here, and I'm just going to go ahead and right after this if no ticket condition, I'm going to paste this whole thing over here. We're basically just referencing ticket config, which we already queried before the switch case up top over here. So we don't have to query it again. We're getting we're getting the ticket configs roles. We're calling .map, okay, and we're basically just allowing the staff roles to still see the channel and send messages to that channel. And then we're basically just going to use a spreader operator, and then we're just going to use a spreader operator to destructure those overwrite resolvable objects, so then we can actually maintain those permissions. Okay, so now if we restart the bot and if we close a ticket, those staff roles that we have added should still be able to see the actual channels. So what happened earlier actually is not what we want. Okay, we want those staff roles to still be able to see the tickets. So let's create a ticket. Now let's close it, and you can see ticket is closed. The permissions are still going to remain the same, and you can see the logs. Closing ticket, it still logs the overwrite resolvable array, and everything is good. So we know that everything is working for creating and closing a ticket. The permissions are staying the same. So now staff will still remain in the channel, and they can perform other tasks. But we haven't implemented those tasks yet, but we'll get to those things later on. Okay? Alright, so let's go ahead and conclude this video with one more thing, and just removing roles. That should be really, really easy, so don't worry about that. It shouldn't take us more than about 10 minutes, I hope. So let's go back into our code. Let's go into our index.ts file where we registered our commands. And what we'll do is we'll add another subcommand. So right after this add subcommand call for our base roles command, we'll call add subcommand, and we'll pass in same exact, or not same exact, but we'll pass in a callback function, and we'll reference subcommand, and we'll call set name, and the name of this will be remove for removing roles, right? Set description removes a guild role from the ticket configuration. So just basically the opposite of what adding a role would do. And then we'll have to add role option, and for the option, it's just going to be the same exact thing. We'll set the name to the same exact name, set description, the role to remove from the ticket config, and then we will set required to true. Okay, and that will configure the subcommand for remove. You could also just, instead of remove, you could just do delete or del if you want. It's up to you. I'm not going to worry so much about that. Okay, so let's go into our roles. I think not roles command handler. Let's go into, so let's go into roles command handler, because remember, we're still going to be under the same base command, which is just going to call. So when the base command is triggered, it will call handle roles command, right? Because roles is the base command. And we're going to be inside the switch case. So we have a case for add. We just need a case for remove. And what we'll do is the same thing. We will await handle roles remove subcommand. We'll pass in the same arguments, and then we'll just break. And of course, we'll need to go ahead and implement handle roles remove subcommand function. And we'll do that right over here. Okay, and then we'll just take in the same exact arguments. So I'll just copy and paste this. It's going to have the same exact signature, so don't worry. So what's going to be different here is we're going to basically take the role that the user entered, and we're going to check to see if the database already has that role for that specific ticket config. If it does, we'll delete it. If it doesn't, then we'll just do nothing. Okay. So what we can do now, here's the thing, right? Because we already queried the ticket config. Well, actually, we queried the ticket config, but we don't have the actual relations. But that's fine. We'll just requery the individual record from the database, because I don't really like to reference the array that is part of the entity object, right? And use array operations. I think it's better to just invoke the database. I think that's a lot more accurate in my opinion. So we'll do this const ticket config role equals await ticket config role repository So that's the role repository that handles interacting with ticket config role entity, which we have up here defined. We'll go back down, and what we'll do is we'll search for the ticket config role. So we'll do find one by, and we want to search by the role ID. So we will need to get the role ID, and then we will need to just pass in ticket config like that. Okay, so we're basically searching with two conditions. One, with the role ID, and two, we're ensuring that that record also belongs to the correct ticket config. Okay, so let's grab the role ID, and it's the same thing that we did in handle roles add subcommand. All you do is you literally just reference interaction.options, and then you call get role. You pass in the name of that role option, and it's the same exact name. So I'll just copy this and I'll just paste this up here. And for the role ID, I'll just set that to role.id like that, because we know that this is going to be a role. Okay. If there is no ticket config role, I'll just simply just reply to the interaction. I'll just say role did not exist. Okay, and then we will just I guess return. If the ticket config role was in fact found by that same role ID and it belongs to that correct ticket config, we will delete it. And to delete stuff, we can do this. We can reference ticket config repository dot delete, and all we need to do is just pass in the criteria. So essentially, I'll just pass in. Well, actually, I'm sorry. It's not ticket config. It's ticket config role repository. I got a little bit confused there. Apologies. Dot delete. So it's ticket config role repository dot delete, and I think we should just be able to just pass in ticket config role like this, and that should just delete it for us. And it returns a promise, so I will await this promise like this. Okay. Yeah, so let's go ahead and try this out. Let me also just do one more thing. Let me go ahead and wrap everything in a try catch. Okay. So in case something goes wrong, we can reply to the interaction. And if everything goes correctly, we can just send a success message. So let me just do that real quick. Okay. I'll also do the same thing for handle roles add subcommand. So I'll take everything and I will go ahead and do this. I'll go ahead and wrap everything inside a try catch. And if an error happens, we will log the error, and then we will reply to the interaction telling them that something went wrong. So that's going to be good for error checking, so that's good. So we are handling our errors in case something bad happens to our code or our logic. Okay, so let's test this out. So we're going to go ahead and try to remove a role from the configuration, and it should delete it without any issues. So our bot is logged in. Let's go ahead and test this out. So I will go ahead and just do this. Let's do, where's the rules remove? Yeah, let's go over here, rules remove. So if I remember correctly, we do have the staff role. I mean, I could just double check by checking the permissions. Staff, blue, and green role. So let me remove staff. And it says delete a role successfully. So if I go into MySQL, and if I were to query the database, you can see that I only have 2 roles, which is good. Let's go ahead and delete. Let's try to delete staff again. You're going to see that it says role did not exist, which is correct, because when we search the database, we didn't find a role by that ID, and also we didn't find it by that ticket config ID. Both conditions need to be met. Okay, let's go ahead and delete blue. You can see that we're left with this one role, which I think this one is green, right? Green. So let's just delete green. And if I query the database, you can see that I don't have any roles at all. So if I were to go ahead and create a new ticket, right, you're going to see that right over here that the permissions are just going to reflect. So it basically does the base permissions, so the bot, and it denies the permission for everyone else, and then it'll add any permissions for the roles if there are any. So you can see that this is a pretty good working system. So basically, in later episodes, what we'll be able to do is, once we save messages to a database, we can actually start creating transcripts, and I'll show you how we can actually save the messages to the database for each ticket. So for now, that'll be pretty much it. Look forward to the episode where we actually create transcripts, and we'll have to do a lot of stuff with setting up an API and all that kind of stuff. We'll also have to create like a dashboard as well. So this will actually turn out to be like a pretty lengthy project. So if you're very interested, like I said, there's going to be a whole series playlist for this whole thing. I'll also have all the code in the description, so you don't have to feel worried, and you can have a reference. So I'll see you all in the next episode. Peace out.